The mixed martial arts fighter Renato Moicano recommends reading Ludwig von Mises' 6 economic lessons. But what exactly do those 6 economic lessons consist of? Let's see it. A few days ago, at UFC 300 MMA event, a remarkable incident took place that was quite remarkable and noteworthy. Towards the end of one of the fights, Brazilian fighter Renato Moicano recommended to the entire audience that they should read one of the works of Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises for valuable insights and perspectives. Please have a look at this video clip that has not been generated by artificial intelligence.
I love America. I love the Constitution. I love the First Amendment. I want to carry enormous fucking guns. I love property. And let me tell you something. If you care about your fucking country, read Ludwig von Mises and the 6 lessons of the Austrian economic school, motherfuckers.
In this case, Renato Moicano is referring us to 6 conferences that Mises gave in 1959 when he visited Argentina by invitation from Alberto Vanegas Lynch, the father of the current economist and philosopher Alberto Vanegas Lynch Jr., who has become an intellectual reference for Javier Milei. Well, the father of Alberto Vanegas Lynch Jr., back in 1959, was acquainted with Ludwig von Mises and extended an invitation for him to come to Buenos Aires. The purpose was to deliver a set of 6 lectures as 6 lessons on economic theory and the intellectual battle that could and should be fought based on that economic theory. The 6 conferences, which were organized as 6 lessons on economic theory, were later transcribed and subsequently published in the form of a book. For example, the Spanish publishing house Union Editorial, which specializes in publishing books from the Austrian School of Economics, has those 6 lessons published in a book titled Economic Policy, 6 Lessons on Capitalism by Ludwig von Mises. Or you can also find them available for free on the internet through the book that the Ludwig von Mises Institute has published in PDF format, specifically a book titled Economic Thoughts for Today and Tomorrow. And as you can see, that book is organized into 6 lectures, which consist of 6 lessons on the subject of economic theory. And what is the content of those 6 lessons that have become extremely popular on social media as a consequence of this argument by mixed martial arts fighter Renato Moicano? Well, the primary lesson regarding capitalism. The fundamental concept of this inaugural Mises conference is that the defining characteristics that distinguish capitalism as an economic system are precisely 2 distinct features. The initial trait that all individuals have the right to. All individuals have the freedom to take initiative to attempt to fulfill the requirements of others in a more advantageous or cost-effective manner than other individuals who are involved in the market. In other words, the first characteristic of capitalism is free market. And the second characteristic of capitalism, the fundamental one even I would say for Mises, is that it is an economic system based on the accumulation of capital. That is, an economic system that transforms individual savings into increased investment in means of production, and therefore, the increase in aggregate savings of an economy tends to translate into an increase in aggregate investment in the stock of means of production per worker, and consequently, in an elevation of the standard of living of all people within that economy through the increase in productivity that is achieved with a growing stock of means of production per worker, leading to overall prosperity and improved quality of life. The second lesson focuses on socialism. Mises defines socialism as a system in which there is not just economic planning, but specifically only fully centralized and monopolistic economic planning. It's not that in socialism there are economic plans and in capitalism there are no economic plans. The primary distinction is that in socialism, only one person or a group of people plans, whereas in capitalism, any economic agent who identifies an unsatisfied need or a method to satisfy existing needs and is better than others existing, any person can propose their economic plans, which will commence competing with the decentralized and competing economic plans that other agents have proposed. thus leading to a more dynamic and diverse economic landscape. The distinction, consequently, is monopoly of economic planning versus free competition of economic plans. And the problem with there being a monopoly on economic planning is twofold. On one hand, any value proposition that is not accepted, not understood, not embraced by the central planning body in socialism simply will not see the light of day, whereas in capitalism, it can happen that a certain entrepreneur, a certain capitalist, may not understand, embrace, or accept a certain value proposition. But if there is another person who does, that person can present that rejected value proposition in the market, compete with other rival value propositions, and ultimately it will be the sovereign consumer who decides whether one value proposition prevails over the other competing alternatives available in the marketplace. In socialism, as we say, that value proposition will not see the light, and therefore the consumer will not be able to validate anything. Simply the diktat will prevail. The mandate of the central planning body, and therefore its only monopolistic economic plan. And secondly, this monopolistic economic planning that characterizes socialism is also negative for Mises, because from the point of view of this economist, modern economies can only be planned on a large scale through the use of the car. For economic calculation, market prices are necessary, requiring the existence of private property over the means of production to establish and determine these prices in a market-based economy. In socialism, no private and decentralized ownership over means of production, no market prices for means of production. Central planner cannot utilize economic calculation. In other words, their only problem is no longer that they may be blind to their ability to understand other rival value propositions, but that they won't even be able to access, won't even be able to generate all the information they would need to be able to plan the economy as efficiently as the economic order that emerges in a capitalist economic system through decentralized and competitive economic plans, which are coordinated through the price system. The third lesson on interventionism for Mises: interventionism is an attitude. It is a policy of a government that consists of overstepping what should be its functions in a liberal political order of a society based on individual rights and limited government. When the government desires to handle additional economic affairs beyond preserving public order and ensuring compliance with contracts, when it extends beyond the minimal functions of a minarchist state, then the state falls into what Mises refers to as interventionism, in its aspiration to control various aspects of the economy in order to pursue the economic policy objectives established by the government itself. Problem with interventionism for Mises? It's a double problem, both static and dynamic. The static issue is that, in general, interventionism will not accomplish its own objectives. For example, if the government wants to make housing more affordable, more accessible for everyone, and to achieve that goal, the government establishes rent control. The only thing it will achieve in the medium term is that housing becomes less accessible. The only thing it will cause is a reduction in the supply of housing, and therefore there will be fewer rental units available. And the dynamic problem with interventionism is that usually governments, when they fail in their interventionist economic policies, won't back down, won't admit they were wrong, and that those policies were a mistake, but instead they will double down. Yes, for example, after implementing rent control, the rental housing does not become more affordable, but rather scarcer, and therefore the rationing of rentals is much greater than what was achieved through market prices. What governments will do, for example, is to force owners of vacant homes to put them on the market, but that will only sink future residential investment in housing, and therefore a medium to long-term reduction in the existing stock of housing in a society, or at least a strong deterioration in its quality. In other words, the access to quality housing, to decent housing, will definitely decline. And in the face of this new failure, what will the governments do? Well, If the private sector doesn't produce new homes because the government's interventionist housing policy completely discourages private investors from producing and supplying new homes, it will be the state itself that takes control of construction, administration, and distribution of housing, no longer as private housing, but as public housing. In other words, what Mises is stating is that interventionism has a tendency to deteriorate dynamically because it creates new mistakes that, instead of being attributed to the initial intervention, are attributed to the market and thus provide a foundation for justifying additional state interventions, until ultimately the state effectively controls the entire economy, approaching what we could refer to as a socialist economy, an economy that is increasingly centrally planned where there is a reduced level of decentralized competition among economic plans. Fourth lesson on inflation Mises defines inflation as the loss of value of money as a result of the increase in its supply, and links the phenomenon of inflation to the need that governments have to create new money to finance their public policies. Mises says governments can finance public spending through raising taxes, issuing debt, or creating new money to fund their programs. And governments usually find it much easier to use the third way, printing money, because that way the cost of their spending programs is more diluted, more camouflaged. But just because the cost of financing a public spending program through money printing and the resulting inflation is more diluted, less transparent, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. What happens is that this financing cost ends up being passed on to those who see a decrease in the purchasing power of the monetary units they own. So it is a redistribution from individuals who hold money and are adversely affected by inflation to the government. The government can spend more because other people can spend less. But that redistribution, as I say, doesn't have a transparent character, but rather it's disguised in price increases, in such a way that governments can always blame the entrepreneurs, the evil entrepreneurs who raise prices, when those prices have been raised because the government has devalued the currency. In this lesson, Mises emphasizes something fundamental for any society to understand, but particularly in these moments, and also in 1959, it must be noted, the Argentine society. What Mises is saying, almost word for word, is that inflation is not a divine curse, but rather an economic policy choice. Inflation is caused by governments as a means to finance their spending programs without raising taxes or resorting to issuing additional debt. Thus, as a political choice, it is feasible to evade inflation if the present government relinquishes inflation as a means, as a mechanism for funding its public expenditure, thereby seeking alternative strategies for financing its fiscal needs. And for the government to renounce it, it is essential that society understands the causes of inflation and why that option of financing public spending programs, creating money above the demand for money to dilute the value of existing monetary units, increasing the effective spending capacity of the state, why that option of economic policy is a disastrous economic policy option, which should never be resorted to, and therefore an option that the population must veto the government in order to prevent negative consequences. Fifth lesson on foreign investment. If we've said that for a society to develop, it's essential to accumulate capital, and that capital is accumulated through savings, what happens when a society doesn't have enough internal levels of domestic savings, or enough national savings levels to accelerate the accumulation of means of production, or to accelerate investment? This society will benefit from attracting foreign savings, capital for increased domestic investment, and internal accumulation of means of production, leading to enhanced productivity of its citizens and overall economic growth. Mises says that most societies worldwide have developed due to foreign investment, i.e., foreign savings, so we shouldn't fear the influx of foreign capital, but rather embrace it. What problem does Mises identify? Foreign capital will enter a nation if it expects to profit from the investment and not be expropriated by the national authorities. And yet, when Mises gave the lecture in the late 50s, and even today, a significant portion of foreign capital entering a country does face a real risk of expropriation, either through direct expropriation, where the government nationalizes an industry created by foreign capital, or through indirect expropriation, such as steep tax increases on foreign investment. If this happens, an economy will be able to attract a smaller amount of foreign investment, and therefore the pace of its development will slow down. And the sixth lesson is a lesson where Mises aims to instill optimism in the audience, because it is a lesson where he reflects on the significant impact of ideas in politics. After having reviewed all the major dangers to the prosperity of free societies such as socialism, interventionism, inflationism, or protectionism, Mises says that we could fall into despair because it seems like we are surrounded by bad economic policies. However, here Mises also sheds light on the horizon, a glimmer of hope, because unlike what happened before the 19th century, where states also implemented terrible economic policies, nowadays all these bad economic policies that states apply to depend are based on bad economic ideas. Politicians can implement socialist, interventionist, inflationary, or protectionist measures because within a society there is an intellectual climate that legitimizes, supports, justifies, or at least tolerates these bad economic policies in such a way that if it is possible to ideologically change a society, if it is possible for citizens to come to consider socialist, interventionist, inflationary, or protectionist policies unjustifiable, unacceptable, then those economic policies cannot be implemented by governments. In this case, let me read Mises' words verbatim because I think they are very well written. Everything that happens in the world of our time is the result of ideas, both the good things and the bad things. And what we need is to fight against bad ideas. We gotta fight against everything that bothers us in public life. We need to swap out the bad ideas for good ideas. We must debunk the doctrines that promote union violence. We must oppose property confiscation, price controls, inflation, and all those evils that cause us suffering and hardship. Ideas, and only ideas, are the light that illuminates the darkness, and those ideas must be presented to the public opinion in order to convince people. We gotta convince the folks that these ideas, the liberal ideas, are the right ideas, not the wrong ideas. The great era of the 19th century, the great achievements of capitalism, were the result of the ideas of classical economists, from Adam Smith to David Ricardo, passing through Bastiat and others. Our priority should be to replace bad ideas with good ideas. And this is something that I desire, and I am confident future generations will be able to accomplish. Our civilization is not doomed. Creation and dissemination of good economic ideas to counteract the bad economic ideas on which many of the economic policies implemented by governments are based, which go against our individual freedom and our future prosperity. Hopefully, Renato Moicano's words suggesting the reading of Ludwig to millions of individuals will have a small impact on the dissemination of these positive economic ideas.